Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third part of the Black experience in the third part of Driving While Black, which is a mini-series out of the Black experience in the Adirondacks. And before we get started, I want to just take care of some housekeeping matters. And for our audience this evening, if you would like to submit a question during this program, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You will only be able to see your own questions. And for questions that are not addressed this evening, ADI, Adirondack Diversity Initiative, will add more information to its website, along with a link to a recording of this evening's discussion. If you are having any trouble during this live stream, please feel free to post a question to the Q&A and a staff person will provide guidance. All right, so before we get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement, just to acknowledge that we are sitting and existing on the spaces that rightfully belong to our First Nations peoples, okay? And I wanna welcome the members of our First Nation community from the 6 nations who are our neighbors in the Akwesasne region. But I always say acknowledgement is one thing. We need to work on equitable practices, right? So that we can revisit and intervene on the oppressions that we continue to reproduce, not just on Black and people of color, but on our indigenous and First Nations communities as well. Again, welcome. Hey, my name is Nicky Hylton-Patterson. I am the inaugural director of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. And today I have the opportunity, the immense pleasure of speaking with Dr. Lorenzo Boyd. Before Dr. Boyd comes on and shares his wisdom and knowledge and many years of working as a law enforcement person or personnel, and also his current role as Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at University of New Haven, I would like to thank all of the people and organizations that make this kind of programming possible. I want to start with our partners. The Adirondack Experience, the museum on Blue Lake. I want to thank David Kahn, the executive director, Steph, who's working behind the scenes. I want to thank our own outreach coordinator, Alexis. I want to thank all the people, my ANCA family, Adirondack North Country Association, and I want to thank, most importantly, the core team members, of whom there are 15 who hold me down and make this work possible. And they've been doing this work since 2014, mobilized and remobilized and planned and plotted and strategized until they got funding to make all this possible. I also want to give a special thank you to Clifton Harcum. Clifton, if you are listening, my brother, I thank you from the ground up. Clifton made this possible. Clifton is the one who reached out to Dr. Boyd. And I thank you, my brother. I can tell you that Clifton and I have grown really close because he is an activist. He's an activist scholar and a revolutionary who's doing the work on the ground in the communities and in every waking moment of his life. And I appreciate him. And he is the one that has brought us together with Dr. Boyd. And we hope to have a long, fruitful relationship with Dr. Boyd. And we are going to bring him to this region. So don't get it twisted, okay? I'd also like to thank my friends and colleagues at the Department of Environmental Conservation. I'd like to thank Commissioner Segos. I'd like to thank all of the people from his office who have been working tirelessly on working with us and empowering us to do the work that we do to make the Adirondacks more welcoming and inclusive. So I thank you all for joining us. I thank you all for staying with us. I want to mention just a few organizations, Eagle Island Camp, John Brown Lives, Wake the Adirondack, the North Country Democratic Socialists of North Country. I want to thank the different municipalities. I want to thank Senator Betty Little, Senator Jose Serrano, and all the other people who make this work possible. People are waking up, they're leaning in, and I thank you for joining us today. Get ready for an insightful, critical conversation about police reform, community policing, what it means to defund the police, and even what it means to abolish the police. All right, and we have our expert here. Let me give you a little bit of background about Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, and I'm gonna expose him right now, because before I said, Dr. Boyd, your bio and resume is so long, I don't want to miss anything. And he says, you know what? Just let them know that I was a law enforcement professional, and what, I'm a nice guy, and I'm at the university. I'm an administrator at the University of New Haven, and I'm a nice guy. But I want to tell you a little bit more about him before I ask him how he got to this position, how he got involved in this work. So please, Dr. Boyd, I'm going to embellish a little bit. I'm still going to talk about your resume, even though you want us to know that you're just a nice guy. Okay? All right. So Lorenzo Boyd is a nationally recognized leader in police community relations and an authority on urban policing, diversity issues in criminal justice, race and crime, and criminal justice system. He served 14 years in the Suffolk County in Massachusetts. Yay! I went to Mount Holyoke, South Hadley, Massachusetts. Sheriff's Department, did I splice that in there? Working in policing, corrections, and the courts. Okay? And it says here, he's currently the VP, as I said, the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer. Apologize, Dr. Boyd, for getting that wrong. He's also the Director of the University Center for Advanced Policing. Okay, so Dr. Boyd has been working to build the center into a national resource for professional development with a central focus on building levels of empathy and cultural competence among police leaders and officers. I'm gonna cut to it. It's 6:09. I want Dr. Boyd to have as much time to address the critical questions, and then we're just gonna open it for all of the questions that you have, because this is critical, this is relevant, this is timely, and we need to get to work. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Boyd, for joining us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate everyone in the North Country. And that's just such a cool name to call where you're from, the North Country.
That's right.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate being invited to have this conversation, and hopefully people will gain information from my talk, and hopefully the police and the community can work together to make the North Country better. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And I want to tell everyone, just to let you know, cue you in, that none of our speakers charged us. Dr. Boyd, if you're talking about access, his schedule is tapped, one, right? And he, rightfully so, is intellectual property, right? Is a resource that many are after right now. So thank you for making the time for us. Bless you, bless you, bless you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Clifton, my brother, for making this connection for us. I'm still gonna call you out, so I expect to see a question in the chat box from you. All right, so Dr. Boyd, tell us about your journey and how you got here to doing the work you're doing.
Well, I spent 14 and a half years in the Sheriff's Department. And when I got on, just like a lot of other police officers or sheriff's officers or state troopers, when I got on, I thought my job was to fight crime and save lives. And if you opened up my jersey, there'd be a big red S on my chest. But then I started to realize the way law enforcement's done in this country, the way policing is done in this country is skewed. And there's a lot of really, really, really good people in policing, God-fearing, law-abiding people that really, really, really want to do a good job. But the problem is the system of law enforcement is problematic and is inherently biased. So we train really good people to pick up on really bad practices, and that's what happens. Because I think most people that go into policing try to go in to do the right thing, but somehow along the way, they pick up traits or practices or there are policies that make them view citizens no longer as community members or partners, and it becomes an us versus them scenario. And the over-militarization of policing picks up on it's the us, we're the good guys, and everybody else is the bad guy. And I could understand that in military and battle where you have an enemy, but in policing, it's about community engagement. So I walked through and I'm viewing this and I kept saying, there's something missing, there's something not happening. So I started to talk to a lot of my friends in the Boston Police and State Police and other police departments across the country. And then I realized that what I was going through wasn't just my county, It wasn't just my city. It wasn't even just my state or my region. It's something inherently problematic with policing. But the good thing is, it's not something that can't be fixed. It's something that we clearly, with some work, can fix. Unfortunately, a lot of people are stuck in the reactive stage of policing and haven't moved toward the proactive community stage. And that's some of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight.
That's right. Thank you. So talk to me a little bit, and I know I have questions to ask you, but you spent 14 years.
14 years, 7 months, 5 days, 9 hours, roughly.
What caused you to leave the sheriff's department?
There's something about earning a PhD that that told me that I should probably move on to another job. So at the end of my 14 and a half years, I was granted a PhD, or I earned a PhD, and I started teaching full time. And that was 20 years ago now. So I've been out of uniform nearly 20 years, and I've been a university professor and or administrator since.
That is remarkable. That is remarkable. That's a seismic shift. You know that, right?
Yeah.
Yes, but you were actually doing the work while you were working full time as a sheriff's deputy, right?
Yeah, yep. I did my master's degree. I did a stint in law school, and all of my PhD, all in uniform.
Wow, remarkable. Thank you. All right, so let's get to sort of the core questions that we have today. All right, people have been talking about defunding the police. Mm-hmm. What does that mean, and how will it help? Let's start with, what does it mean?
Well, first of all, let's talk about defunding. And people get caught up in the rhetoric, in the words, in the verbiage, because the concept of defunding the police is not a new concept at all. It's something that police administrators go through every single year and have been going through every single year for generations. So instead of the word defund, ultimately what it means is resource reallocation. Because every year there's a city manager or a mayor debating with the police chief because there's only a finite amount of money in the budget. This year in particular, because of the pandemic, because of COVID, because of the quarantine, fewer people are working. We're bringing in fewer tax dollars. We're taxing people less. There's less in sales tax because people aren't around. That means states are getting less money, and states are then giving municipalities fewer dollars. So now there's less money to spend. So when we talk about what we need to do, if the police were used to getting 50 cents and your city gets $1, this year your city may only be getting 70 cents, and we can't give the police 50 cents of that. So everybody's budget has to come down a little bit. Now that's one side of it. So understand how that works. Every year police administrators ask for more money. Every year they can justify more equipment, more training, more officers, whatever. But the flip side is the mayor or the city manager still has to fund parks and recs, and still has to fund schools, and still has to fund other services. So there's a finite amount of money. So that dance happens all the time. This time, it's a little different because we're starting to see a lot more negative stuff happening in policing. So let's take a step back, because I've done 80 or 90 interviews since the George Floyd murder, and people ask me, why George Floyd, why now? And the thing I keep saying is, it's not about just George Floyd, because if you think it's about George Floyd, you're not paying attention. It's not just George Floyd. It's not just Breonna Taylor. It's not just Ahmaud Arbery or Michael Brown or Sandra Bland or Walter Scott or Tamir Rice or Laquan McDonald or Freddie Gray or Alton Sterling or Eric Garner, Philando Castile. I could keep going, and that's only in the last 4.5 years. So the issue is that there's more outrage because of stuff that's happening with the police. And we want to kind of get a handle on that. The police keep saying we need more officers, we need more equipment, we need more militarized stuff. And the community is saying, whoa, you guys are already pretty aggressive. You guys are already reactive. So the defund the movement says, let's take some of this money in policing and put it into something else. So when we talk about police budgets, let's just be clear. According to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, These are police administrators telling us this. According to IACP, typically police budgets, between 80 and 90% of a police budget is personnel, salary, and benefits. 80 to 90% of that. About 10% of the police budget is just strict overtime. So now with the defund movement, what happens if we take some of the overtime money and put it into programs to prevent the reason that we need overtime?
Ooh.
Because we understand some of the things that are going on in society. And if this were a classroom, I would tell you, write this down, because this is testable material. Because
That's
crime
right.
is not the problem. Crime is symptomatic of larger problems in society. Crime happens because of transiency, levels of abuse, substance abuse, addiction, low education, underemployment, homelessness, all these things together. And because of all this stuff, crime rates tend to rise, and we need to then put police officers on overtime to handle some of this stuff. So what if we take some of the overtime money and put it into some of the social services that leads to levels of crime? Because if you deal with the underlying issues, crime rates will go away. Crime is not the problem. Crime is symptomatic of larger problems. And if you only look at crime, you're looking at smoke and you're ignoring the fire. So when we talk about defund the police, what they're saying is, let's not upgrade their cars right now, or let's take some of their overtime and move it into social services. Because the one thing we know is that young people commit more crime than older people. We know that crime happens more between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. when kids are out of school and unsupervised. And we also know that after school program, Boys and Girls Club, YMCAs, they are not getting level funded. Parks and Recs not getting level funded. So the kids are now out creating more havoc. So if we take some of that overtime money, put it back into Parks and Recs, give the kids something else to do, then the crime rates themselves will go down. So when we talk about the defund the police movement, we're not talking about getting rid of officers. We're not talking about police officers taking less money. We're not talking about taking away your stuff. What we're talking about is some of the overtime money, transferring that into the reason we have overtime. So if we say defund the police, that's like a dog whistle for people. What we're talking about is resource reallocation. That's really what we're talking about. And that's something I think everybody can get behind.
So give us an example of where you've seen this happen in the nation. Can you, yeah.
So I was just recently working with the mayor, Eric Garcetti's people in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. They decided that they were going to move $250 million into social services, into community services, to try to deal with some of the things that cause crime. And of the $250 million, they were going to take $150 million out of the police budget. And people lost their minds. You can't defund LAPD by $150 million. Well, the total budget for LAPD is $1.8 billion. So to take $150 million, that's about a quarter of their overtime budget. So we're not losing officers in LA. We're not furloughing people. We're not cutting people. Everything else remains the same. We just take a percentage of their overtime budget and turn it in. Also, New York City, they're trying to move about $1 billion out of NYPD and move it into social services. The New York City Police Department budget is over $6 billion. So what they're going to do is they're also going to reallocate how they use some of their officers. So some of the plainclothes people, they're putting them back in uniform. They're putting people back on tactical gear. They're pulling people from administrative tasks. And instead of making them administrators, they're making them the police again. And they're out there allegedly protecting and serving. So they could take that money and it's not that big a deal. Richmond, Virginia, $93 million budget. $6 million of it is overtime. So what happens if you take $2 million out of their overtime budget and turn it into things? So it happens in a lot of cities. It happens in many cities, and it tends to happen pretty well. It's pretty efficient.
But how much can $2 million do? How much in the grand scheme of things, especially, so let's talk about New York State.
Okay.
Income inequality, especially in New York City, because I'm from the Bronx, is just, it's almost impossibly overwhelming, right? So when you're talking about crime happening between 3 and 7, especially now, when they're wrestling with whether or not to bring kids back to school, you're going to have, and I'm telling you, I've worked with many, many school systems in the Bronx. That's going to be exacerbated.
It is. It is. But here's the thing. Stop making it just a police problem. One of the issues that we have with policing is we expect the police to do everything. It's not the police's job to do everything. And I push back. I've worked with about 30 different departments in the last 20 years or so. And I keep getting the police chief and the department to push back against the city because municipalities use the police as a social dumpster. Anything that happens, if they can't figure out what to do, they give it to the police. And that's not fair to the police. So then we see the police showing up on scenes, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to act, not knowing who to address, because we're asking the police to do things outside of what they're supposed to do. What I want the police to do, I want them to protect me. I want them to serve me. I don't want them to do 8 or 9 other things. I don't want the police raising my kids. I don't want the police necessarily making social services assessments on the street. I don't want the police making mental health assessments. We need to put other people in there. So the original question is, how far can $2 million go? It's not just that $2 million from the police. It's also city services having their own budgets as well. So it's supplementing budgets. Again, we can't have everything fall on the backs of the police because that's why we see a lot of failure in policing because we ask the police to do way too many things.
Thank you. Now I want to remind our guests that please submit your questions in the chat box. I want to, so thank you, Dr. Boyd, because I've been saying that I don't understand what defund meant. I don't understand what abolish the police means. What I would like to see is that the police are not expected to do things that they are not trained for. Yeah, and so thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a critical point and really unpacking what defund means. Okay, so the word I was used to was sequester, right? And you say reallocate, which is the same. But I want us to talk about something else. The other outcry is about abolishing the police, right? So I just mentioned that. What does that look like? What does it mean? And can it work?
Let me start at the end and work backwards. Can it work? Yes, absolutely. But let's now talk about it. So when we say abolish the police, what we don't mean is get rid of policing, have no policing at all. Nobody wants that. Even in the most high crime community, good people there deserve and expect police services. So we're not talking about just totally getting rid of police. What we are talking about is abolishing the negative systemic problems in policing. Because if we take a look, policing has been around for 400 years. Policing started in South Carolina as slave patrols. So if you go through slave
laws,
and then you move towards slave laws, and then you move towards the civil rights movement, then you move towards the stop and frisk nonsense that happened. There's been a negative relationship between the police and communities of color for 400 years. And the one thing I can tell you, the way we currently do reactive policing doesn't work. We need to reimagine what policing could be. So when we talk about abolishing the police, what we're talking about is abolishing the traditional method of policing and reimagine policing based on community standards. Now, the next question, has it worked anywhere? Yeah, it's worked in 2 different places recently. So in 2011, a small town, Jennings, Missouri, they decided they had so much problem with their police, they decertified every single police officer, including the chief, and made them reapply for their jobs. They started 2 or 3 months earlier working with community members, coming up with community standards. Because, you know, it's funny when we talk about police and we think the police are the end all be all for all the knowledge. But that's actually the wrong way to view this. If I can give you a parable, the history of the jungle is written from the perspective of the hunter. The lion doesn't get to write the history because the lion is killed or captured, or the lion has the hunter's knee on its neck for 9 minutes till they die. So we don't ask the lion anymore. It's always the hunter's version of the story. And when we go to court, it's the police's version of the story that most people buy into. So what if we did a paradigm shift? What if we study policing from the perspective of the community? What if we ask the community how they want to be treated? We do it in relationships. So when you start talking to somebody, what works for you? Do you like flowers? Do you like candy? Do you like dinners? What works for you? So talking to the communities, finding out what the social mores and norms are in the community, and bringing community members in as partners is what we want to do. So in Jennings, Missouri, they started working with the community to come up with a set of standards that all police officers had to abide by. So they said, we're going to decertify you all September 1. And they started in June saying, okay, we're going to have you reapply. And if you don't get hired by September 1, you're out of a job. And most of the officers were actually hired back and retrained with the new community standards. Some officers were jettisoned or not hired or fired, not recertified, and then they moved on to other departments. One of the people that was not hired back in Jennings, Missouri was a guy named Darren Wilson. He didn't get hired in Jennings, and then he subsequently got hired in Ferguson, Missouri, and then within 2 years shot and killed Michael Brown. So we knew all of the problems that he had. We knew, or they knew ahead of time, all the complaints for the use of force. So in Jennings, Missouri, it worked. They got rid of their bad officers. And because of unions, it's really hard to let a bad officer go. If you decertify everybody and just not hire back the people that are bad, that's one way to do it. The other place is in Camden, New Jersey in 2013. And if anybody knows anything about Camden, that was rated the most dangerous city in the nation per capita, the most dangerous. And they realized that the corruption in the police department was such that they couldn't effectively police the city. So they pretty much fired everybody, had the same community standards again. And then what they did was they rehired people based on the new community standard. And a lot of people didn't get their job. And it was so corrupt there that they decided that they didn't want to have a Camden City Police Department anymore, that they then had Camden County Police. And what happened there is we saw that crime rates went down, police community relations increased. And if you've seen in either Time or Newsweek last year, they said that Camden, New Jersey is a, quote, very livable city. And they said it's a good place to raise your kids. So in 7 years, it went from the most violent city per capita to a very livable city where you can raise your kids, because not only did they get rid of the corrupt cops, but then they dealt with the community in less of a harsh way. So can the abolish movement work? Yeah. And the one thing I can tell you is most police departments know who the bad officers are. Most officers say, I don't want to work with this guy because he's likely to be troublesome, but they can't get rid of them. They refuse to talk about them. So if we do broad sweeping changes in police departments, then the chiefs can get rid of their bad people.
So how does that, the broad sweeping change in community, leading from a community perspective, intervene on the police unions? Because that's, and the fraternal order of police. What was that?
It starts with training, because the one thing every police department needs is a level of cultural competence. And every time I talk to a police chief, I ask, hey, would you like to diversify your department? Every single officer said yes. But because of the negative relationship between the police and communities of color, most people of color don't want to go into policing because they see what happens. And when you look at policing in America is viewed through a white male lens. because 72% of the police officers in this country are white and 83% of them are male. So when we view policing in America, it's a white male standard that we're viewing. But unfortunately, 73% of the population in this country is not white and male. So you want a police department to better reflect levels of diversity, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, lifestyle. The more they reflect a community, the more they understand what's going on in the community.
Right. Now, I remember Camden because when I was getting ready to do my second master's, I had applied and got into Rutgers. And I was like, and this is 2012. I was like, oh, hell no. And I actually ended up going to Syracuse for other reasons, but I kept thinking about getting an apartment in Camden and negotiating that, you know, and it's not like I'm from a squeaky clean place in Kingston, Jamaica, right? I'm from Kingston 13, where there's snipers on the roof, and you know, and so and drug dons control the corner. So, but just having to think about that and additional layer. So for you to be telling us about Camden, the ways in which the community were able to lead and re-envision what policing means is remarkable. All right, so let me ask, go ahead.
Camden is not perfect, but it's a way better place than it was 7 years ago. They still have work to do.
Yeah. All right. So before I ask you the other question, I wanna talk a little bit about my experience when I've been speaking to different law enforcement agencies, and we talked about training, right? Mm-hmm. And in each case, when I ask about cultural consciousness, cultural competency, I was surprised to know for most of the officers that any diversity in equity and inclusion kind of training or orientation stops at the academy. Mm-hmm. So if you were on the force for 20 years, the last time you had, you know, deep and consistent engagement with cultural consciousness and development was 20 years ago or 25 years ago.
Possibly, yeah.
That to me, I was floored by that. Then how do you expect difference when you don't continue the human development around cultural consciousness?
Well, let's unpack that a little bit.
Yes, please.
So in this country, in order to be a police officer, you had to reach 21 years of age and acquire a GED. Okay. So 21 years of age, we give somebody a badge and a gun and we put them through an academy. We understand that the human development of a brain doesn't even finish until 25 or 26. So they're still 5 years away from fully developing who they are, but yet we give them the ability to make life or death decisions. So when we talk about what cultural competence means, if you look to your neighbor to the east, southeast in Connecticut, the police academy, police officer standards and training, 905 hours. Depending on your jurisdiction, you spend between 80 and 100 hours with firearms. You spend about 40 hours doing defensive driving and driving tactics. And you probably spend another 20 to 25 hours with defensive tactics, hand-to-hand combat. And you spend 4 hours on community relations / cultural competence. 4, and you have to get both of those in. So when police officers are under stress, they have muscle memory. They go back to what they learned, what they've done the most. And most police departments across the country, every single year, you have to requalify on the gun range with 40 hours every single year. So when police officers are under stress, it doesn't surprise me that the firearm is something that they go to and not verbal de-escalation, because they don't spend that much time. Remember your trigonometry or your calculus or your geometry class from high school? How many people are using it now? You don't, because if you don't use it, you forget it. So if we can get police officers or police departments to add cultural competence training the in-service training, because everybody every quarter typically does some sort of in-service training. And every time I go to a police department after there's a major issue, the first thing that the command staff tells me is, Dr. Boyd, we had somebody go through our procedures and our general orders and our standard operating procedures, and they said that they are not racially biased, so we don't know what the problem is. So if it's not your policies and procedures that are racially biased, what is it then? There's only two things: there's policy and procedure, or there's practice. If it's not one, it has to be the other. But faulting the police officers for not knowing something that they weren't taught is also not fair to them. I'd like to fault the administration for not bringing in this level of training. And again, when police budgets decrease, one of the first things they lose is their training budget. So right now, this year, 2020, police commanders have their back against the wall. But we put resource into things that we think are important. So if you think cultural competence in 2020 is important, you need to put resource into it. You need to pay and have people come in. And it's not enough just to have somebody come in one time and do an 8-hour training and then leave again.
Thank you.
That's like your high school geometry class.
Mm-hmm.
It is to have somebody come in quarterly and working on stuff. And when I go into agencies, I spend a day or 2 or 3 or a week with them, and I give everybody my cell number. And I say, when things come up and you work through it, call me and let's debrief. And let's figure out what you did right, what you did wrong, how you could have done things better. Because when I come back at the end of the quarter, we're going to talk about these things. I do a lot of training with scenarios, and I bring community members in because I want community members and police officers to hear the same message together. And I want the police to understand the lived experience of the people they're policing. Exactly. So we go through scenarios, and here's the fun part: we simulate traffic stops in the classroom, but I have the police officer be the driver, and I have the citizen be the police officer, and we go through, a couple of steps, and then we stop and debrief, and at the end, the police will say, "Really? Is that how you really view me?" And then the citizens are like, "Wow, you were being a really jerk to me, and I'm just trying to do a traffic stop." So we get people to understand. And the problem is that once we've given power to the police, they forget what it's like to not have that level of power. And then we start talking about police officers and reform. And reform is not saying, hey, you're bad. What reform is saying is we need to make things more efficient for you. And whenever we talk about police reform, police officers across the country lose their mind. My phone rings off the hook every time they start talking about police reform. But what about us? What about what we do? We put our lives on the line. And when I talk to people, I say, you think white fragility is real? Blue fragility is for real, for real.
Ooh.
And I need you to bring it down a notch. We're not talking about getting rid of you. We're just trying to make your job more efficient. So when you deal with community members, it'll be a better outcome, not only for you, but also for the community member.
Whoa, blue fragility. I can't wait. Oh my gosh, we can't wait for you to come to the North Country. Blue fragility, but I am just excited. I'm on fire. We have so many questions that are being lined up by our audience, but I want to get through to, I know you touched on police reform. I'm going to ask you 2 questions in one because we need to get to our viewers' questions. We have been hearing about community policing for years, and you're just talking about bringing police and the community together. You schooled me the other day when we were going through our tech run, right? About changing behavior opposed to changing attitudes. So community policing for years. At this point, it seems like lip service. Is it time to abandon that concept? 1. And what types of police reform are needed to repair the relationship between the police and the community? So let's start with the first one.
No, we cannot abandon community policing because most departments don't do it. So when I go into a department, when I meet with the chief, the first thing I tell him is, I need to know about your community policing, your department. And generally the chief, he or she will say, oh, we've been doing community policing. Let you meet our 6 community policing officers. Time out. I can tell you right now, community policing fails because community policing is not a strategy. Community policing is a philosophy. So if you have 6 officers that think they're community policing officers, every other officer says it's not their job. We need every officer to reimagine what this means. And again, community policing sometimes put the onus on the police, which is not fair to the police. What we need is a partnership between the police and the community. And the hard thing is right now to get the police to roll into a community, particularly a community of color, and say, hey, you can trust me. I'm not going to hurt you. And then you look down at their belt and they've got a gun and, taser and pepper spray and all these tools to hurt me, but yet you're telling me you're not going to hurt me. And we cannot expect people to just say, okay, I'm going to be friends with the police now because you determined you're going to be friendly. Quick story. I was with my 6-year-old grandson. We were at a park and the lady came up with a dog.
You got a grandson?
I've got it.
Okay, let me stop. Go ahead, brother. Yes.
So,
yes.
Grandson saw the lady with the dog and ran over behind me. It was a cute little dog. And the lady said, hey, do you want to pet my dog? And my grandson said, no, thank you. He walks over a little closer and said, no, it's okay. You can pet him. And then my grandson looks and said, no, thank you, ma'am. He's a polite kid. So then the lady kneeled down in front of us with this cute little dog. And she says, it's okay. The dog doesn't bite. And my grandson had a furrowed brow and stared at the dog and said, but doesn't your dog have teeth?
Mm.
So when I talk to police and they say, we're not Minneapolis or we're not Glenn County, Georgia, that's not us. How many times do you have to see somebody get bit by a dog before you decide, I'm not going to mess around with dogs?
Mm.
So the institution of policing has shown itself multiple times because your department in the North Country, there could be great officers in the North Country. I don't know. I haven't met them. But if policing as an institution has issues, why then would they think you're going to be okay? How often do you have to get bit by a dog or see someone get bit by a dog before you decide, I'm not trusting dogs? So we have to change the culture of policing. And far too many times, police chiefs, and just at 2:00 today, I was on a conference call with 2 different police chiefs that needed to do procedural changes in their department. And I pushed back and said, you fail when you do procedural changes. You need to do cultural changes because culture eats policy for breakfast.
Culture eats policy for, I'm writing that down. Blue fragility and culture eats policy for breakfast. Welcome to the North Country, Dr. Boyd. Yes, we are grown and fierce up in the North Country and ready for the lessons that you have to teach us and the journeys that you're going to take us on. So I want to switch now because we are running out of time and take these questions. Okay, so the first question is, and it's from Stephanie Nova, and Stephanie asks, I'd love to hear what you feel some of the differences are between policing in the city, suburb, rural, and wilderness community areas. And she says, thank you so much for bringing these conversations and knowledges to us. So let's talk about those differences.
That's a great question. The bulk of my career I've spent studying, researching, publishing, writing about training urban cops. Suburban policing is a little different. We police very differently. And the one thing I can tell you, having never been to the North Country, my guess is people in Lake Placid or people in Clinton, the police a lot different than the people police in Brooklyn or in Queens or in Manhattan, because policing is very different in different places. And being in the North Country, you could afford to be a little more courteous. You could afford to be a little more community oriented because it's such a small area and people are supposed to know each other. The flip side is, if I'm in the city, I know my backup is right around the corner. Up in the North Country, and you've got a department that only has 12 or 15 officers, you may not have 2 or 3 officers on at a time, your backup may be a lot further away. So what that doesn't mean is the police need to be more aggressive to handle the scene. What it does mean is the police need to be more creative in their conversation. Because the one thing I can tell you is most people aren't out to get you, officer. Most people aren't. So to think that it's an us versus them scenario, even in wilderness policing, is problematic. We still need to treat people like people.
All right, thank you. Now, I'm gonna make a shout out for Saranac Lake, because Lake Placid is the home place of Winter Olympics. So they have much more traffic, and even though they're smaller than Saranac Lake, the village of Saranac Lake, they tend to have more of an international diverse community that comes through. But most of the North Country doesn't look like Lake Placid. Okay, I want my guests and participants to tell me that I'm wrong. Most of it looks like, I'm gonna say Malone in the town of Saranac. The Saranac Lake is actually the most populous center in the Adirondacks. So the park is diverse in terms of 6 million plus acres. Very, very rural, and overwhelmingly white. And the places are a lot of places are remote, right? And enormously underpopulated. So Lake Placid, you mentioned Lake Placid. Love me some Lake Placid, yay. But it's what I believe is not typical in terms of the population and populations that come through. So let's go, because we have so many questions. But Jean Darlin asks, can you talk about police unions and their role in blocking reform? So we brought up, ooh, yeah.
Jean, that's a great question. Full disclosure, I'm a big fan of organized labor, and I was a shop steward and a president of my ASMA union when I was in uniform.
Yes.
But police unions tend to be the problem. Police union protects officers, but they also protect bad officers. And police unions a lot of times don't see the big picture. They only deal with immediately what's in front of them. And I get the trying to make better salaries and better working conditions for the officers, but blocking reform is problematic. And the one thing I can tell you about policing in general, the police dislike two things. One, they dislike change, but they also dislike the way things currently are. And that's the mentality that tends to be in many unions. Again, I've not been in the union up in the North Country, but in the urban centers and the unions that I've been to, it's problematic, which is why the abolish the police movement is so prevalent, because that's the one way you can get officers off the job and bypass the union, if you just decertify everybody and make them all come back. But unions in general protect everybody, and that's problematic. There needs to be a release valve that unions let bad officers out. Because when I was talking about the FOP and the union up in Minneapolis, they said, you have to take into account Officer Chauvin's point of view. And I said, you know what, we can't finish this conversation if that's where you start.
Oh, ooh,
Wow.
What point of view? Before or after the knee stayed on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, with his hand in his pocket, after his subordinate asked him, should we turn him around? After the paramedics got there. Yeah. And asked them to release the man. But so let me not go there. But the next question, the transgender community also has a problematic relationship with law enforcement. I was wondering, and this is from an anonymous attendee, if you could talk a little bit about what kind of reforms to policing are useful for repairing that relationship.
Well, the one thing I can tell you about the LGBTQ plus community, specifically trans communities, the biggest problem is the lack of knowledge that people have. If we start from the perspective of we need to treat people like people, we need to treat citizens like citizens, if we start there, we're okay. But if there are people that are transitioning or going from one to the other, or, have, lifestyle changes, that should have no bearing, because that's not against the law. The problem we see is that when people have their personal biases. My thought is the more we can spend time training the police on LGBTQ plus issues, and I'm not just a fan of making people allies, I want people to be advocates. Because if we...
I'm gonna stop you right there, because I've been using the word accomplice. So you need to start using that too. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, I stopped you, but go ahead.
This goes back to training and knowledge. because people don't know what they don't know.
Yes.
If you grew up in a small village or hamlet and you've not known anyone that's transitioned, it's strange to you. Because you just don't know. And it's not enough for me to tell somebody with a GED who's been on the job 20 years just because it's the right thing to do. They don't have a frame of reference. What we need to do is to educate them. And people say, I'm sick and tired of educating people about what they need to do. We need to keep pushing forward, and we need to keep educating them, because an educated officer is a better officer.
Thank you. I just want to right now just acknowledge Governor Cuomo, who has begun the work of signing in the Walkie While Trans law, right? And we also talked about his say their name reform bill, right? And we talked a little bit, but I'm going to go back to the questions because we have quite a few, and I really do want to get through to some of the larger ones. So Naj Minkoff, Naj, you have to help me pronounce your last name. Naj is a friend, right? And an accomplice, an anti-racist accomplice in the I think the village of Keene or the city of Keene, where I do have my Pete Nelson, one of the core members, is also my very, very, very good friend, and a lot of allies and accomplices in Keene. But Naj asked the question: policing is difficult work. On a second's notice, I think this is a comment. On a second's notice, and Naj is a journalist. On a second's notice, they can go from sitting at a desk to dealing with some horrific event where people are in anguish. They're supposed to stay centered and tend to take out that tension on their spouse, their children, themselves, or in some other situation, taking out their frustration out on some individual in a harsh way, often a person that they see as the other. How can training be modified to help them to let go of their emotions in a safe way instead of taking it out on themselves, their family, or people they are hired to protect?
Well, Naj, great point. And let me take it one step further. When we talk about the war on cops, people give the illusion that there are some bad people out there that are just gunning down cops across the nation. Last year was the safest year for policing as far as felony assaults. Last year was the safest year since prior to the Nixon administration. So we don't lose all that many cops. Last year, I think we lost 156. And people think that's a lot. Losing one officer is one officer too many. We never want a fallen officer ever. But we lost 156 officers. There are 800,000 officers in this country. We lost 156. So the numbers are really small. What we're not talking about, and I think is the point that Naj was getting at, when the police fall, they're more likely to die by suicide than by homicide. Because for 3 years in a row, the rate of suicide has outpaced police homicide. And in New York City, they've been averaging for the last year and a half, 1 suicide per month. But only about 10% of police agencies have anti-suicide protocol. So we're just kind of leaving them out there because of the machismo and things that we don't talk about. And we're supposed to keep it, bottled up. What we need is to tell them it's okay to talk about it. We need to have an employee assistance program that actually works. And we also need to talk about them ahead of time. At the University of New Haven, the Center for Advanced Policing, when I took over the center, we abandoned the idea of building a better cop. I think that's passé. What we do is we take students in high school, college students, and officers on the job, and we give them compassion. We give them levels of empathy. We teach them how to communicate, and we make them critical thinkers. So we're looking at a holistic approach. We're trying to build a better person and usher them into policing. Once a person's already on the job and they got into the negative stereotype of policing, it's really, really, really hard to unlearn that. If we can get the guys and the girls in early enough and teach them the stuff that's going to happen, because let me just drop some knowledge on you, because police officers are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than the general populace. They're 300 times more likely to have substance abuse issues than the general populace. The divorce rate in this country is hovering around 54%. The divorce rate in policing is up around 70%. So we need to take care of the officers that are supposed to be taking care of us. And if you look at President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, there were 6 pillars. Pillar number 6 is officer safety and wellness. It's the wellness part that we need to talk about, because domestic violence is really high in policing, higher than in the general populace. If we can give them some sort of way out, that'll be helpful. But the problem is, if you train them to say, each traffic stop could be my last traffic stop. Well, technically that's true. This webinar could be my last webinar. So every last could conceivably be your last, but the community is not out gunning for the police. And the Gallup poll told us last year that most people aren't anti-police at all. Most people are actually ambivalent about the police, because most people don't deal with the police all the time. The problem is we have the police with this macho attitude, and it's these us versus them, and we teach them that they need to be warriors. It's the warrior mentality that's problematic. The system is broken. The police aren't warriors, they're guardians. Very few times you have to be a warrior. Most times you're just a guardian, and people call you because they need your help.
Guardian over warrior. Now, I'm going to piggyback. This question is from Dr. Jen Ball. Dr. Ball is a friend of mine and a close anti-racist accomplice. So I'm seeing a lot of people I know in here. Dr. Boyd, she's asking, and she is the Chief Inclusion Officer at Clarkson University and the Title IX coordinator. She's asking, she says, hi. She says, I've admired your work for a while. How would you apply your work to higher ed campus safety / law enforcement?
Well, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm on a 3-year contract with Yale University right now. I'm doing a lot of stuff at the University of New Haven and at my alma mater, UMass, right up the street from Mount Holyoke, working with their campus. But the one thing we need them to understand is campus policing is community policing. So when I go in, that's where I start. And if you notice, most of the time I don't use the term law enforcement, I use the term policing, because law enforcement is only about 20% of what the police actually do. So calling the police law enforcement is like calling me a test grader. Do I grade tests? Sure, but that's just a small part of what I do. The vast majority of what the police do is service and administrative tasks. So reminding the police to get back to their roots. And on a college campus in particular, people do really stupid stuff, because we got 17 to 22-year-olds away from home for the first time, a bunch of people congregating, testing limits and boundaries. We have to remember back when we were young, and I thank God that most of the mistakes I made was before the internet, because people are posting stuff. So we need to tell our campus police, as much as we can, refer as much as you can to the conduct board. And if it's not a felony, you probably shouldn't be making arrests. Remember, policing on college campuses are supposed to be mentors. And Dr. Ball, if you want to talk more about that, shoot me an email and let's chat.
I will make that introduction possible, because so they are moving together and working with some incidences happen in Potsdam on the Potsdam University campus. So they've started thinking carefully about these things, right? Especially with the police, campus police. Now, I want to get to 2 more questions. Can we do 5 extra minutes? I just got the word that we can do 5 extra minutes. Can you manage that, Dr. Boyd?
I could actually give you 15 minutes if you still have more.
Oh, yay. Okay, so I'm going to go to Keelan Murphy asked, are police departments marketed the most recent war firearms, torture tactics learned in the save, often by employing soldiers? So I guess what the question is the gear they use.
Okay, now, for 8 years, I was the advisor to the police chief in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Fayetteville is the county seat where Fort Bragg is. And unfortunately, and I'm a big supporter of the military, but I want my soldiers fighting overseas, not at home. And they used to bring a lot of people directly from battle. As soon as they get here, then they go into police training. And there was two guys in particular that 6 months ago, they were in Afghanistan killing people, and now they're about to graduate from an academy in a city. We need to have people debrief and deconstruct some of that stuff. So the paramilitary version of policing, the police, when they get extra money, they want to buy extra toys. I'm trying to get police departments to move away from the militaristic thing. And when I talk to police departments, I try to get them out of the tactical gear. Although, full disclosure, I love tactical gear because it had a slimming effect. So I like the blackout tack gear. But we want to remind the police that you're service-oriented. You need a softer approach. And I have my students at the university go out and query police officers. I usually ask my students, how many times do you think the police officer uses their gun in a day, in a week, in a year? And how often do they make arrests? And the things that people believe are outrageous. And most police officers go a week or two not making arrests at all because they're not arresting people every day. And many police officers go their whole career without discharging their firearms at work. So the fact that we're training them for what might happen, I think that's problematic because the vast majority of what the police do, specifically in rural and ultra suburban areas, is service. It's extremely rare that a whole bunch of people are coming down with heavy armament trying to take over your town and we need the police to roll out in tanks. Doesn't happen that often. It's not that movie.
Okay, all right. All right, so from Jordan Hornstein, Dr. Boyd, these insights seem so rational and so promising. Where is resistance to these ideas greatest? From the law, what is this? From law enforcement, from the politicians, from the public? And are there regional differences? So let me read the first. Where is the resistance to these ideas greatest? Law enforcement, politicians, or public?
The resistance is greatest in policing because when we talk about police reform, and again, I've probably got 250 police chiefs on my phone right now. And when I talk to command staffs, when we talk about police reform, so imagine, Jordan, me going to your job and telling you, let me help you do your job better. You're like, what? So if somebody came to me after 20 years to say, look, Lorenzo, let me help you fix how you teach, I'm going to feel some kind of way about that. So going into policing, saying that there's a problem with how you do your job, it's unnerving for a lot of people. So the biggest resistance is from policing to say, we're going to help make you more efficient. But the good thing is when I go in, I can tell them, I understand what you did. I did this for just about 15 years. I understand. I'm trying to make your job easier. I'm trying to reduce the level of stress. The flip side is what's happening more often, elected officials are saying, you know what, we've had enough and we need to start doing more to help policing. Because the question is, to borrow the final summation from Johnny Cochran in the OJ trial, who polices the police? We've let the police police themselves for so long that they don't understand or they don't know how to fix the problem. So now police, elected officials across the country are deciding they're going to do police reform. And the other sweep is getting rid of qualified immunity.
Yes.
Now, I'm not pro or con for the purposes of this conversation, but what I'm saying is that a lot of elected officials at the state level are removing qualified immunity, and what it's saying to the police, if you do your job, it's not going to be a problem. And then cops will always tell me, well, there's always that one that could, whatever. Well, you've got your police union backing you. You got the city backing you. You may have the state backing you. Qualified immunity is not something that police officers use very often. And most of the time that I see it being used, the police officer probably shouldn't have done what they did, and they probably shouldn't have the job anymore. So the resistance comes mostly from the police. And what region of the country? It's across the country. Whether I'm in Atlanta or whether I'm in small towns or in Houston, in as much as Chief Acevedo in Houston, when he and I talk all the time, the former police commissioner, Gary McCarthy in Chicago, and the new police commissioner in Chicago, when we talk, everybody views it the same way. So there's not really regional differences. Command staffs want to change, but the people on the ground tend not to.
Wow. All right, thank you so much. I don't want to go on any further because ADI is sponsoring another program that starts at 7 o'clock. I know, right? And this program, I just want to encourage you all to make this a double header. Go on over to North Country Community College live and watch another, yes, we have another program, in our Black History in the Adirondacks series. Tom McGrath is talking about Abolitionists Rising, the Tortured Life of John Brown. And that program is brought to you by the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, the North Country Community College, and John Brown Lives. We are making waves in the North Country. We're educating, right? And this is about educating, and we cannot wait to get you up here, Dr. Boyd. Yes.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Yes, we're going to put you up in one of these lakefront camps. Yes. And yes, employer services right here so we can get the knowledge and do some real work around engaging the community and the police.
Leave your people with one last thought.
Yes, please.
It's not enough to be quietly non-racist. It's the time to be loudly anti-racist.
Preach, 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 preach. This is how I ended the last anti-racism one-on-one series, the difference between being non-racist and anti-racist. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Dr. Boyd. It was such
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun. Thank you, guys.
It was such a pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you in the next few weeks up here in our country. Right. As long as we can make it socially distanced and healthy to bring you up here to continue this education and employ you for the knowledges you're going to bring to us to help us move forward in this time. Okay?
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for joining us. Please go over to NCCC and watch as we bring you the Black History in the Adirondacks. Thank you, Dr. Boyd. God bless everyone. See you soon. Bye-bye.